Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. Today we have renowned author Russell Gmirkin. Hello, Russell.
Hi.
Russell has written a number of books regarding the timing, chronology, and composition of the Hebrew Bible. And today we're going to be going through some of Russell's research on what is found regarding when the Hebrew Bible was written. So straight into it, Russell. When was the Hebrew Bible written?
Well, my theory is that it was written as late as 270 BC at the Great Library of Alexandria. Now, this may seem rather startling to some listeners. It goes against 20th century scholarship, but there's a whole history of the debate as to when the Hebrew Bible was written. And there are three basic models that have been used historically. The first is the fundamentalist model, which has survived through most of time, where Moses wrote the book of Moses, and Samuel wrote the book of Samuel, right on down the line. Now, chronological anachronisms in the biblical texts have ruled that out for most people. But among scholarly circles, there is a second model, which is the maximalist dating model. It tries to date the books of the Hebrew Bible as early as possible, taking into account anachronisms. For instance, Genesis refers to the time when there were kings in Edom, and so obviously it was written at least in the 800s BC. So under the maximalist model, you're going to date parts of the Pentateuch to the 800s, and Isaiah is close to the time of Isaiah, according to the biblical authors, except for sections where there are anachronisms. And so they date those down as small as possible. It's as close to the fundamentalist view as possible, taking into account archaeology and inscriptions. Then there's the minimalist view, which only arose in the 1990s with a gentleman from Copenhagen University. His name was Niels Peter Lemke, and he wrote an article in 1993, the Old Testament, a Hellenistic document or something like that. So his article was very radical. It said, why are we dating all these books as old as possible when the first evidence for the Hebrew Bible arises in the Hellenistic era? The Septuagint translation of 270 BC, the Dead Sea Scrolls a little bit later. Why are we dating them all as old as possible? Let's look at the young end and see if possibly they could have been written in the later times when we actually do know that these books exist. So he was one of the very first to propose that maybe the books of Moses, the Pentateuch, were written as late as 270 BC, around the time the Septuagint translation into Greek took place. So my research across several books, which is well known in some circles, tends to support the minimalist model, that these books are quite late. And that, as I mentioned, the books of Moses were written as late as 270 BC. And written by the same team of scholars that legend says came to Alexandria to translate the Hebrew Bible from Hebrew into Greek. according to my models, these were also the authors as well as translators, but we'll get into that. So that's kind of an outline of the three competing models.
So looking at the chronology of when they were written, the perception is that Genesis, being the first book, was written first. Do you agree with that?
Approximately, that's approximately true. It seems to me that Genesis through Joshua were written just about simultaneously. The whole story of the colonization of Judea, starting with the promises to the patriarchs, and then the Exodus under Moses and the conquests. That's all one very connected story. It's not a bunch of little tiny stories that were assembled through time, as some scholars believe, but it very closely conforms to the Greek literary genre of foundation stories, where there were often promises to an ancestor that his descendants would later inherit the land, such as the promises made to Hercules. And then a later phase where the descendants migrate and conquer the land and occupy it, and so on and so forth. And the whole story from Genesis through Joshua very closely conforms to that Greek genre. So it's all connected and must have all been conceived and written about the same time. We know it's a Greek story because these Greek foundation stories had an expedition leader who not only led the colonizing expedition, which was a conquering army to the new land, but once he was there, he established its laws and constitution and national institutions, religious institutions, exactly like Moses in the Pentateuch. So to me, that's very strong, compelling evidence that this was all one connected story written at approximately the same time and under Greek influence that could only have arisen after the conquest of Alexander the Great in the East around 325 BC. That's a very long answer to a very simple question. I apologize.
That's fine. So for those out there who will try to dispute your timeline, can you give us any evidence for the actual dates that you give these books to be written?
Yeah, a lot of this evidence comes from my earliest book, Berossus and Genesis, Manethu and Exodus, the Hellenistic histories and the date of the Pentateuch. So in that, I went through all the possible lines of evidence where some of this material from the Pentateuch came from. The way you date a text is you look at what older text that it relies on. And if those older texts are dated, then that gives you a date range in which the text must have been written. So we know off the bat that the books of Moses were written sometime between like 1000 BC, the monarchy, and 200 BC, 270 BC when it was translated into Greek. So that's the initial parameters. But there's a lot of passages in Genesis that clearly utilize Homer. And an author named Philippe Wadenboom, he went into this somewhat, and there are other authors as well. So that places it certainly after 700 BC. My latest book, as well as Wadenboom's research, indicates that the Pentateuch used Plato's laws. A lot of the laws that are Mosaic laws actually come out of Athenian law, and specifically out of the literary text, Plato's Laws, which was written around 350 BC. So, okay, so we know that it was written 350 BC or later. Then next, there's Exodus, which clearly has a connection with an account by Manetho that you find in Josephus. He talks about the Hyksos kings who Josephus equated with the Israelites. These shepherd kings being expelled from Egypt into South Syria and founding Jerusalem. He talks about Osersif, the Egyptian priest, and his followers being expelled, maybe in the time of Ramses, into Judea again. So there's clearly a relationship. And in my book, Berossus and Genesis, Manetho and Exodus, I showed that Manetho was not using the biblical text, even though there's clearly a relationship. He was relying on native Egyptian literary traditions. But rather, the book of Exodus was responding polemically to Manetho's account. And I won't get into all the arguments here, but so if the Exodus story was using Manetho, then that means it had to be written after 285 BC. And then once again, the first 11 chapters of Genesis use a Babylonian author named Berossus. He had a creation story. He had 10 generations before the flood, which he took from the Sumerian king list. He had the flood story. It appears he had a story related to the Tower of Babel, so on and so forth. All these exotic Mesopotamian cuneiform traditions that scholars acknowledge that the early chapters of Genesis draw on. Well, they're very exotic. Some of them are extremely exotic, found only in these temple libraries. They were all translated in one place in the History of Babylonia by Berossus. So Genesis used that book, and that places it after 280 BC, and so on and so forth. The Table of Nations, the Genesis 10, which lays out the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their respective nations. If you just take a look at those three groupings, they correspond almost exactly to the kingdoms that arose after the time of Alexander the Great. The Seleucids in the north, who correspond to the descendants of Shem, the Ptolemies in the south, which corresponds to the descendants of Ham, and then the sons of Japheth were kind of outlying countries that were neither Ptolemaic nor Seleucid. So that Table of Nations corresponds very closely to the political geography of around 273 BC. So here you have evidence that the books of Moses were written no earlier than 273 BC, but we know that they were translated into Greek around 272 to 269 BC, virtually the same time. So the biblical authors are using Greek sources like Plato and Manetho and Berossus that are found in the Great Library of Alexandria. They read these Greek sources, but they write in Hebrew, so the authors were bilingual. And there's a translation that the Septuagint was translated into Greek around 270 BC by a delegation of Jewish and Samaritan scholars who were invited to Alexandria to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek at the invitation of King Ptolemy II Philadelphus. So we can infer that there's these bilingual Jewish Samaritan scholars reading Greek sources who wrote the Hebrew Bible. And at this virtually the same time, you have a legendary historical tradition of bilingual Greek reading Jewish scholars, translating it into Greek. So my book hypothesized or deduced that this is the same group of people. They went to Alexandria, to the Great Library of Alexandria, where they were under royal sponsorship. They read all these legal and historical sources in Greek. They wrote the books of Moses in Hebrew, and then they translated them into Greek on the spot for the Great Library. That was their mission. So that's maybe my my major contribution to biblical studies.
So from your research, what have you found to support or not support the documentary hypothesis?
Well, so the documentary hypothesis, it's what passed for source criticism back in the 19th century, 18th century, middle of 20th century. Source criticism back then was all internal to the Bible. The authors of this theory looked at the book of Genesis in particular and saw that there were several distinct voices. The J voice, which is storyteller that uses the name Jehovah, and the Elohist who uses Elohim, the priestly source, and then later on you have the Deuteronomist. They each had their distinctive vocabularies, their special themes. If you take that material, that source material out of Genesis, some of them, especially the Yahwist, forms a connected narrative by itself. You know, they think the priestly material was added later and the Elohist and so on and so forth. So the documentary hypothesis suggested that there were 4 distinct sources, which they said, you know, the first was shortly after Solomon. That was the Yahwist, Elohist a little later, and Deuteronomist around 600 and something BC, and the priestly source in the time of Ezra, century by century. But there's never been any evidence that these were written at different times. I think that there is strong evidence that those were distinct voices, but that they were all contemporary. That there were these allegedly 70 scholars who came from Jerusalem to Alexandria to translate the Hebrew Bible. They actually wrote it as well, but you have 70 different authors, really, if you want to look at it that way. But there were different groups of authors, you know, the Yahwist, Elohist, so on and so forth. I'm fine with that, but they're all contemporary. And in fact, they're intertwined. Sometimes J uses E, sometimes E uses J, same with J and P. There's a lot of evidence that they were contemporary groups. And that's my take on the documentary hypothesis.
So I often get into conversations with Christians about the biblical timeline in terms of the events. So they often say to me that they believe that the Adam and Eve story is approximately 4000 BC and 1600 years later is when Moses compiled the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, given your timeline and your chronology, does that fit?
Well, the Greeks would have agreed approximately with the time of Adam. The Greeks said, they claimed that humans were, when they were first created in the age of Kronos, they were naked. They just ate from the ground and sprang up with fruit. It was like a paradise. The gods lived among them. Everything was cool. But very shortly thereafter was the age of Zeus. Here's these poor, naked, defenseless humans without technology. Prometheus had to provide them with technology right away. In some legends, Prometheus made the first humans. But anyway, the basic thesis was that immediately after humans were created by the gods gave them civilization, because otherwise they couldn't have survived. And the Greeks knew that civilization was only just a few thousand years old. So there's various estimates in Greek sources that the humans arose, 300 BC to maybe 9,000 BC, same general time frame. So the biblical creation story really draws on Greek traditions in that respect. But no, obviously the world is much older than 4000 BC. I had you going there for a while.
Yeah, yes, you did have me worried there for a minute or two.
Sorry about that. No, the world is obvious, in script, the pyramids are older than that. And so it doesn't accord with archaeology or geology or anything. It's it's very convenient and comforting to have one book that contains all the information in the world. You become an expert in that one book, and you can stop. Belief systems are comforting that way, and many of us have been there. Back when I was a teenager, true confession, I went to a Bible college, and they said, really, really learn the Bible cover to cover, become an expert. And I did, and that was their first mistake. So, it's come back to bite them, I think. But you should not get all your information from one source. Because, well, for instance, you shouldn't learn about geology from, I hate to say it, from your pastor or whatever. Go and read a book on geology. If you want to read about, in our church, we learned about evolution from the church's perspective, and it was the most ridiculous thing you could conceive of. So it's like a doctor, you need a second opinion. Go read one I'm censoring myself for your audience, which is, I don't know, is very sensitive. So read one darn encyclopedia entry on evolution, and you'll see that it's nothing like they tell you about. There's substantial evidence, so on and so right down the line. Everybody has to defend themselves from the beliefs that they grew up with, because everyone on earth have different beliefs, just randomly based on their geographical and other background. And you have to grow out of it. You have to explore the world, learn things for yourself, learn things from the experts, not with filters, and then that liberates you intellectually, spiritually, in every way. And that's just my advice.
And in closing, Russell, can you tell us about your books and your new book you have coming out?
Certainly, my first book was, Berossus and Genesis, Menatho and Exodus, and we kind of covered that already. My next major book was Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible, that went through all the evidence that Plato's laws were used by the biblical authors. And in fact, the whole idea of a Bible comes out of Plato. His book on Plato's laws said that when you found a new nation, you should create these foundation myths. You should make sure that citizens believe their laws were given them in ancient times by the gods. And you should have a national literature that supports all that. You should have censors that censor out anything incompatible with that. The nation should read only that collection of books, and then and they'll grow up in that belief system. They'll believe it's all true, and it will support the new government. So that was Plato's laws. My current book is Plato's Timaeus and the biblical creation accounts. And it will really go through the Greek background of Genesis 1 through 11, and especially Plato's scientific and mythological account of the origins of the universe. And Timaeus maps right down the line with Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 through 3, because Plato not only had a supreme cosmic creator God in the eternal realm that created the beautiful cosmos, the universe, the heavens and earth, but he delegated the task of creating mortal life to his sons and daughters, the ordinary Greek gods running around on earth. And you get exactly the same thing in Genesis 2 through 3. Yahweh is not the creator. He's a dinky terrestrial god. He's one of the sons of God that is referred to a few times in early Genesis. He's the son of the creator of Genesis 1. That this distinction between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 through 3 is different creation accounts at different times. No, they're all Timaeus. They're all Plato. It's going to be a very radical, amazing book. So the origins of monotheisms, the origin of belief systems, lots of good stuff, and it's really in the final phases of production right now. Russell, coming soon to a library near you.
Thank you. Russell, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to having you back, especially to discuss some of the content in the new book. I'm particularly interested in what you said regarding Genesis 1 and 2, and actually Genesis 1 through to 11. So we look forward to having you back again soon.
Oh, me too. I look forward to it as well.
Thank you.